Those that are here, my name is Edric Mendoza. I'm with the Global Home Education Congress Board. So it's my privilege to be able to facilitate this session and introduce our speaker. And here's how I'll introduce him. His whole write-up is actually in your workbook. So the one thing I want to say that is in the workbook about him is that he is the founder and director of the Institute for Excellence in Writing and the father of 7. The second thing I want to say is his system works. My wife is with me on this Congress, and she just mentioned to me how our eldest son is 13 now, he hated writing. And it was a struggle to get him to write one paragraph until this year, where he tried. My wife was able to come across the curriculum of Andrew Pudewa, took my son through it, and this year he was able to write a 52-page essay on our trip to climb the highest mountain in our country very recently. So it works. And the third thing I want to say, which is what he wants me to mention to you specifically, is that he is the founder of the Looks Too Young to Be a Grandparent. He actually has 8 grandchildren. Can you please join me in welcoming our speaker, Mr. Andrew Pudewa?
Thanks, Eduardo. I'm afraid this is getting a little dated, though, because now I probably do look old enough to be a grandparent. So I'll have to start a new club soon. Looks way too old to be a great-grandparent club. But anyway, thank you for joining me. This topic is developing language arts in the homeschool. And that is kind of my specialty. I travel around the US, Canada, and the world, actually, helping parents to help children better their communication skills. Mostly I work in English because it's the only language I speak very well, but the system which I teach is applicable to any language because it is about the structure and the style of communication, and this of course would be transferable. But what I wanted to share with you today is a little bit about what we might call the 4 language arts. Now sometimes if you talk about language arts, you hear about things like handwriting, spelling, literature, speech. Sometimes there's too many of them. And so to simplify, which is one of the things I like to do a lot, we're just talking about 4 of these arts of language. So what are they? So in the simplest way, we think about the arts of language or the skills of language as listening and speaking and then reading and writing. Now, what's very interesting in the United States, at least, is that these first 2, listening and speaking, are not really taught consciously. People assume that children will learn to speak and listen without any need to teach it or reinforce it or any kind of instruction. And so they're kind of neglected in schools. Unfortunately, what we can see is that the listening and speaking ability very, very directly impacts the reading and the writing ability. So the latter 2 are dependent on the former 2. So if we fail to do a good job of nurturing these skills of listening and speaking, our consequence is we will have lowered skills in reading and in writing. I don't know about your countries, but in the United States, we are now having a crisis in reading and writing. Reading comprehension skills in high school students are at an all-time low. Writing skills in high school and college students are a tremendous problem for the college university professors, for the business people. In fact, everywhere I go, when I talk to business people, they will constantly ask me, "Oh, do you have anything for my people, for my employees? They cannot write 3 sentences that make sense. They cannot write an email that has any organization at all." It's a universal complaint. And so I have been contemplating this for a while, and I do believe that one of the big problems is that we are failing with the listening and the speaking. Consequently, teaching the reading and writing is much harder. Just a moment about the importance of language arts. We do tend to think, okay, these do happen naturally. You grow up in your country, you learn to speak the language that you grow up speaking. Everybody does. Very few people fail to learn to speak their language. The question, though, would be with what quality? With what ability do they use and understand the language? Of course, language is the foundation of all the learning. Even if you go into the maths or sciences, you must be able to understand and communicate those ideas in language. That's what makes them concrete and easily transferred across time and space and to other people. Also, we know that students who have excellent language skills will have success in other academic areas as well. So there's a very direct correlation between confidence in communication skill and other academic performance. Then, of course, one of the things we talk a lot about in my circles of homeschooling is the need for more leadership. We hope, as homeschoolers in the United States, to not only raise children who can read and write and think and have a faith and a perspective on history, but also have the confidence to stand in front of their peers and communicate those ideas, to write winsomely, persuasively, and effectively, so that they can transfer those truths that they learn in the home school to the people who so desperately need it. And so this theme of leadership education is very strong in the circles in which I travel in the homeschooling in the United States. I always kind of point out sometimes to children, boys in particular, they don't like writing. They find it tedious. And they say, well, I don't need this because I'm going to be, an engineer. And I point out, it doesn't matter what you do. You may become an engineer. You may become a garbage collector. You may go into the military. It doesn't matter what you do. It's the people who can read and speak and communicate well that rise to the top in their profession. The good engineer remains an engineer because he is a good engineer. But the good engineer who can communicate, speaking and writing, engineering ideas, he becomes the vice president. He becomes the one who has ultimately the greater leadership, the greater influence and potential. So whatever our students are called to with their natural aptitude, having excellent language skills will promote opportunities for leadership in the future. So let us think a bit about this listening and speaking. Why do we not teach listening and speaking in school? Actually, anymore. We could go back 150 years ago and note that, yes, there was formal instruction in listening and speaking, but now we just consider it unimportant or automatic. The reason we don't teach it in school is because they are not tested. And the reason they are not tested is because they cannot be easily quantified. You can give a child a reading comprehension test, and they can fill in multiple choice, and they can decide, you can decide how much of that do they understand, or how well do they understand it. Give a score, 82% or something. You can do a writing test. Okay, how many points can you get compared to perfect on a writing test? But it's very hard in schools to give a listening test or a speaking evaluation. And of course, one of the big problems with institutional education is that we have to measure students. We have to treat it like an assembly line with a percentage of error, and we have to measure everything. And in doing so, we end up teaching to the test, and it becomes a shallow or mechanical approach. So one of the things I am very much opposed to, actually, is the overuse of testing. And sadly, in the United States, we do see some circumstances in which these standardized tests that are used in schools are now becoming pushed on homeschoolers as a strongly recommended, or in some cases, a legal requirement. And I think this is not very healthy, because the system itself is not treating children like human beings, it's treating them like little machines that get programmed or fail to get programmed and have to be reprogrammed. So, talking a little bit then about each of these four. Listening. We do believe, and it does happen, that listening accidentally develops. You could never think about it and just have a child and they could grow up and they would learn to hear things. They would learn to listen a little bit. In fact, it's interesting, in English we have two words, hearing and listening. Hearing is kind of an intransitive verb. You don't have to hear something, you just hear, right? And you can't not hear. Sometimes you are hearing things you don't want to hear, like loud, irritating music when you're actually trying to have a calm, peaceful thought. But listening is a transitive verb that it requires an object. You listen to something. It's not accidental. And so while we do develop the skill, we can develop it more to a greater ability or a lesser ability. Listening is critical to reading comprehension. And I do believe this is one reason why we are suffering low reading comprehension rates in the United States schools, because children they're not able to recognize the words on the page. When you think about it, reading, you see a word, you recognize those characters. In English, we have to sound out the word. Some languages are a little less painful in this way than English, but nevertheless, you have to decode the symbols, then you have to recognize the word, then you have to remember what that word means from having heard it, from context in life. If you have not heard that word, if you do not have a meaning attached to that sound, when you see it and decode it, there's no comprehension, right? There's no understanding. I'll give you an example from one of the more irritating English phonetic combinations. There is a word, sleigh. S-L-E-I-G-H. This is, of course, the thing you ride in through the snow. Okay, so let us say a child is trying to read, and they see this, S-L-E-I-G-H. They attempt. Sligha. 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 What's a sligha? I don't know. There is no sligha, right? Oh, wait a minute. Now I remember. E-I-G-H. A. That's like 8. And way. That word must be sleigh. They can figure out through process of elimination, right? Now, sleigh means something if you have an image or experience connected with the word. If you have never seen or heard or read about a sleigh, when you see the word, it has no meaning. They climbed in the sleigh. Well, what does that mean? It could be they climbed in the box. You don't know. So this is why then building the auditory development of language affect the reading comprehension. When you see a word, if you don't already know that word, you can't figure out what it is. Now, older students can use tools like a dictionary. So if you or I are reading and we see a word we don't know, we can look it up, redefine with other words, and continue on. But young children, they really cannot do this. They are limited to their reading comprehension by the auditory vocabulary they have established through years of listening. Does that make sense to everyone? Now, one of the problems I believe we have in the world today is impediments to good listening ability. The first is that we live in the environment of auditory pollution. Pollution meaning that there's a constant interference with our ability to hear different things well. Many times you see homes where the television is on continuously. That television or radio creates a buzz or a humming in the background that actually makes it harder to hear and concentrate. Or you have a very chaotic type of environment with a lot of buzzing and humming and electrical sounds. Makes it harder for children to concentrate. This example right now, you are listening to me, but you have to not hear what's next door. You have to concentrate to cancel that in order to focus here. So it requires more energy for you to do so. Well, young children don't have that same amount of willpower to differentiate and cancel and focus. And so that is why one of the most important things I think we can do is to keep a quiet, calm, auditory environment for young children. And in most cases, the home is much better than an institution. I will confess, teach in schools. I do teacher training, and so I visit public schools, private schools, Catholic schools. And every time after I leave the school, I feel, I must relax. I was so stressed by the constant hum, buzz, energy, noise level of that institution. And it's nobody's fault, except what happens when you put that many children in one room and that many people in one building and that many things you have to get done in one day. There's a chaos to it, you see? The second thing I think we have lost that is making it much harder for children today is the family culture has really changed in the last 50 years. Or you could go back to 100 years if you want to be even more dramatic about it. 50 years ago, what did families generally do when they had time together? You know, after dinner, at home, on the holiday. What was their activity? Well, talking to each other, having conversation, particularly in some cultures, reading to children. 100 years ago, you think about it, there was no electricity, so there was nothing to do. You couldn't go anywhere. You couldn't do anything. The only thing you could do was read books, generally out loud, and talk to each other, and learn communication skills. Learn to listen and to speak. It was a natural environment. But what do we find today? Our environment now is shifted greatly to what? Entertainment, right? TV, internet, video games, even the adults, we are very distracted by the latest news or the Facebook or any of the things that can pull us away. And so I think this is a great handicap for modern families in terms of language development because we are constantly trying to be entertained and entertain our children. And then you have families where both parents are working, and this is an economic necessity, and they come home, they're exhausted, turn on the entertainment, they can relax a minute. Nobody blames them, but the sad thing is what is lost is that environment that cultivates good listening and speaking opportunity. One of the things I've noticed is that if you cannot listen and follow a complex argument, you cannot read and understand a complex argument. In fact, if you cannot hear and understand a complex sentence, you really can't even read a complex sentence. And my good friend, Andrew Kern, says, if you cannot read and understand a complex sentence, please don't vote. Because what we see then is the dumbing down of the whole society, which, of course, brings a lot of great problems. So what are the effects of the good listening? Number one, if we want them to have good writing skills, they need to have a lot of listening. Now, what is the connection there? Because when you listen to excellent language, either by being read to out loud or conversing with people at an intellectual level above your own, then you are acquiring right there the sophisticated language patterns, better vocabulary, better syntax. You know, I find it very hilarious that people are concerned about the social environment of homeschool children. Because all you have to do is walk into a school and stay there for 8 hours, and you would be very concerned about the social environment of the school, because it's all peer-based. And what happens with peers, when children spend time with other children exactly their same age, they sink down to the lowest common behavior, attitude, and language level. I mean, honestly, what can an 8-year-old learn from another 8-year-old? But what can an 8-year-old learn from someone older, a 12-year-old, an older teenager, an adult? So if you want to improve the language environment, the mixed age environment is far superior, because then the older people will be able to pull up the younger people. The younger people will emulate and imitate the older people. So personally, if I teach in a school where everybody is the same age and, grade 5 classroom, it's horrible. I much prefer a school or a homeschool class where there's 3 or 4 years of difference between the oldest and the youngest. It's such a better teaching environment. It's such a better language development environment, because you can pull everybody up and there's no sinking down. Also then, one interesting question. How many of you had your parents read out loud to you when you were a child? Okay, most people, some sad, I wish. But it's interesting, when I ask people, people will say to me, I write pretty well. I know how to write well. I will ask them, did your parents read to you? It is the #1 predictor of good writing skills. People will say, I don't remember learning how to write, but I always got good grades on my papers in college. I always got good marks in the university. How is this? They don't remember learning it, but it was mainly because they were being read to a lot as children. So I strongly recommend to everyone that you read out loud to children as much as you can from the good and the great books in your language. And if you're bilingual in multiple languages, that builds that database. Now, sadly, a lot of people think that when children start to read on their own, that's when they should stop reading to them, right? The schools actually promote this, that children's independent reading skill is the most important thing. Of course it is for the school. That's how they administer standardized tests. But I would argue that actually it's when children start to read on their own, that's when they need to hear language and concepts above their own decoding skills. This is what builds and grows their comprehension. So what we see in the public sector is that students kind of do a lateral shift through literature. So they start to read, and the parents and teachers are very excited. Oh, he can read, she can read. And then they give kind of junk books, Star Wars, Babysitter's Club, this kind of stuff. And everybody's excited. So they read it, it's titillating, it's interesting. And then they get a little older and they have to read something that looks like it's written for somebody a little bit older. So then they read something, whatever is popular, Percy Jackson, Harry Potter. And then they get a little bit older and they have to read something looks like it's written for somebody a little bit older. Twilight or Allegiant or something. Then they get a little bit older. Now they are adults and they have to read something that looks like it's written for adults. So they pick up Danielle Steele, Clive Cussler. But if you actually check the quality of the writing, the sophistication, the vocabulary, there's not much difference between Danielle Steele and Babysitter's Club, except for the length of the book and the debauchery of the characters. Then these people, when they try to pick up a classic book by, say, Bronte or Dickens, they try to pick up a classic, they read and say, I can't understand this, and throw it away. Why? Because nobody pulled up the comprehension. So the key to pulling up the comprehension is to read above the level the student would read on their own and discuss, talk about it, define words and idioms, make sense of it. Then gradually they feel comfortable with increasingly difficult literature. As I said, if they only read what they can read, they will be limited. This is true in everything. Did you notice? If you do what you can do, but you only do what you can do, you will only be able to do what you can do. But if you have a coach, a model, someone to pull you up, then you can do something you cannot do, and that's how we grow and improve. So it's kind of common sense. But the schools, again, sadly, have made independent reading the goal. And I've even heard teachers say, oh no, don't read to your child because they need to read on their own. Although research proves, if you want people to grow up and enjoy reading, the most important thing you can do is to read out loud to them, because then they grow up and enjoy reading. This, in an extensive study paid for with hundreds of thousands of dollars by the American Library Association, proves common sense. Isn't it exciting when research proves common sense? I always find it enjoyable. All right, let's talk a little bit about speaking. This is the other of the soft, kind of the unmeasurable of these four language arts. We think it is a natural or accidental ability. It's very environmental. Not just the language we learn to speak from our environment, but the nuance with which we learn to speak that language. And I think in almost all countries, you will discover that people speak differently depending on the geographic area in which they grew up. So it's a very subtle differences, and it is natural, accidental, but could we make it a little more intentional? Could we use some educational strategies to improve speaking ability? Can it be practiced? Is it a skill that can be developed? I would argue yes, and I would argue that it's very important to develop this skill. This word you may not be familiar with, elocution, is from the Latin, and it is speaking well. And 100 years ago, we had little report cards. We still do have report cards that give grades in different subjects, like science, B-, English, A-, PE, A+. But 100 years ago, this elocution was on the report card. They actually gave a grade in how well students could stand up and recite language, either memorized patterns or give impromptu, spontaneous speeches. And this was considered a very important skill. Now, of course, we don't really do it anymore because it's just not all that important. And we're very busy in schools preparing for standardized tests. But I would argue that there's two key developmental concepts here that we can use to improve speaking skills. One is narration, the other is recitation. Now, to clarify, and those would lead into the advanced idea of formal speech and debate, competitive debate. I know we have a pretty good homeschool debate league in the United States. And if you're ever interested, we can bring some high school debaters to your country and do a demonstration debate and get you all excited about policy debate. But narration is the first skill which can be practiced, and that is when children verbally tell back from their experience what they did, what they heard you read, what they read. And this idea of formally kind of sitting down, take a few minutes, tell me what we did. You can start this with very young children. You make cookies with a 5-year-old. Okay, we made cookies in the oven. Okay, please tell me, what do you remember about making cookies? What did we do first? What did we do next? What did we do next? Or you take a trip. What did we see? Or you read a book. What do you remember from the book? And giving the child a formal chance to narrate back, to tell what they experienced. This does many good things. Now, it is much easier in home education because of several reasons. One, you have more one-on-one time with children. In fact, even if you have a large family of 4 or 5, 6, 7 children, you have more one-on-one time than any classroom in any school that has to be probably 20 or 25 or 30 to one teacher. So you have time in the homeschool. Secondly, you have the shared experience. So you can listen to the child and then ask questions and delve a little more because you shared that experience. Also, if you do this regularly, it becomes a habit. And it's a good habit to have, to be able to recall what happened. Especially handy when you get to be in the looks too young to be a grandparent club and you start to forget things more easily. But all through my children's growing up, I would be traveling a bit, and so I would call home. You call home. How's it going? Fine. What'd you do today? Nothing. Okay, next kid, how are you? Yeah. No, but wait a minute. How could you live a whole day and do nothing? No, the problem was you don't have the habit. So I tested this on one of my children. She's number 4 out of the 7. And so when she's about 5 years old, my wife, my older daughter, and myself, we were narration every time. Every time we do something. Julia, what did you do? How did you do it? What happened next? What happened next? And for several years, when she was 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, she would be given this opportunity to do narration of things in her life. Well, it became a habit, a thinking habit. And so then I would call home. How's it going? What'd you do? Nothing. Really? Yeah. Okay. Next kid. Hi, Julia. How's it going? Oh, Daddy, you wouldn't believe what we did. We did this and this and this and this, and then we did this and this and that. Oh, okay. 10 minutes later. You know what? I better talk to Mom now. She got the intellectual habit of noticing things. It develops fluency, attention to detail. It develops sequencing, organizational skills. All of these kind of soft, fuzzy things that transfer so key into written communication as well. So it's preparation for fluent writing. When you think about writing something down. Okay, you're sitting there. You're going to write a letter. You're going to write a blog post. You're going to write something, article about homeschooling. What's the first thing you have to do? Think a thought. What's the next thing you have to do? Say that thought to yourself, right? You have to talk the idea to yourself before you have anything to write down. And so this relationship then between speaking and writing is so critical. The second thing would be recitation. Again, something that modern education has kind of thrown out. What am I talking about? I'm talking about children memorize and then recite good quality language. Poetry, scripture, excerpts from famous speeches, lines from plays, anything. Now in doing this, you gain 2 things. Number 1, you expand the language database, right? Because when you memorize something, then you have to learn the words and the grammatical patterns. And if you memorize something correctly, then you're building the language database with correct patterns. I lived in Japan for 3 years when I was 21 to 24 years old. And I became very aggressive about learning the Japanese language. And I kind of hit a wall with this because I knew all the words I needed to know to say whatever I wanted to say, but I never knew if it was a natural way to use those words. I'm sure most of you have had this experience. And of course I would ask, my friends, I would say, how would you say what I just said? Of course the Japanese people, they're too polite. No, very good, your Japanese, excellent. Yeah, but how would you say it better? Oh, your Japanese, very good. Okay, useless. So I decided to memorize a whole thing in Japanese. I decided to memorize the fairy tale, Jack and the Beanstalk. Jaku to Mame no Ki. That's it. Been a long time. So I got the book from the Kinokuni bookstore, and I took it to my Japanese teacher, and I had him record into the cassette tape. That's how old I am. Cassette tape. Remember those? I had him record the story, and then I learned to practice and recite the story every day. Took me months, but finally I memorized the entire. Mukashi, mukashi, Jack to you no kodomo ga imashita. Jack wa itazura ko nandakedo. I could go on for a little while, but anyway, I memorized this whole thing. And 2 things happened. One is, I could entertain Japanese children like you would not believe. I'd go to someone's house for dinner and start telling them this story, and they're like, they've never seen anyone who could do that, let alone a big ugly white guy with a funny accent. The second thing, though, is I saw the power of memorized patterns. I'd be trying to say something, and a little sentence or phrase would pop out of the memorized story into my speaking, and I could change the words, the nouns, verbs, adjective, parts of speech, whatever, and I could say what I wanted to say with a more reliable, correct pattern. Do you see it? And I could go on and on. I have many stories about how memorized language improves fluency and sophistication of skills. And so you get this huge benefit. Now, doing recitation, memorization, recitation, again, much easier in home education. Why? You have more one-on-one time. You can customize the content to your values, right? So if you want children to memorize scripture, well, you can do that. If they are in the public school, that's not going to be even an option. And you won't have time because the public school will eat up most of the time that you might have. You can choose poems that are interesting, particularly to certain boys or certain girls or certain children. Also, the more you memorize, the easier it becomes to memorize. So you build up an increasingly larger database of memorized language and building all the fluency. And this, of course, then creates an ease with more complex syntax and sophistication of thinking. And, of course, this is excellent preparation for writing as well. So those two things, narration and recitation, very, very powerful in developing the speaking and consequently then the writing skills down the line. Now, reading, of course, is a very important thing, and children do learn to read at different speeds. Have you noticed this? We tend to think, okay, you must learn to read in grade 1. So everybody who's 6 years old must learn to read. Then what happens is some do, some don't. Well, now what? The ones who don't start to think, I'm stupid. They start to hate it. And as soon as you start to think you can't do something and you hate it, what's going to happen? It's going to be harder to learn. And so it gets worse and worse. So reading is more, I have discovered, my observation of all my children and many, many hundreds or thousands of other people's children, is that reading is actually more of a brain function than an academic subject that you can guarantee you will teach this by a certain age if you just put in enough time. I happen to know some children who were very delayed. In fact, I'll tell you a little story in a moment. Again, teaching reading is much easier in home education. Can you imagine being a teacher of 6-year-olds and you have 27 of them and you have to teach them all to read at one time and they're all at different levels of ability and it's just chaos? I mean, first grade teachers are some of the noblest people on earth because you'd have to be a saint to do it. Otherwise, you'd be an idiot because there's easier ways to make money. But you have one-on-one individualized instruction. In fact, in about 10 or 15 minutes a day, you can accomplish way more than what a teacher would have to spend 30 or 40 or more minutes on in a school working at the whole group. Secondly, you can individualize the levels and the interest, and you can compensate. And this is a huge thing for the learning difficulties that make differences in reading ability. So you encounter, I'm sure in every culture, in every language, problems decoding the symbols that are based on dyslexia, dysgraphia, ADD, auditory processing, all of these issues. And so when you can individually teach a child reading, then you can compensate for this more easily. And we do have, I think, a couple sessions coming up in the conference on homeschooling with special needs, so that may be of interest. I have experience. My son Christopher, very, very dyslexic child, possibly the most dyslexic child I have ever met. He did not read a book until he was 12 years old. He couldn't read. And it isn't like my wife and I don't know how to teach someone to read. So we're spending 3-4 years trying to pound this into his little brain, and he's getting more and more frustrated. He's also completely red-green colorblind, so I just have to say, thank heavens we're homeschooling. If this child had gone to kindergarten or first grade or second grade, 2 or 3 years in an institution, and he would have convinced himself he's the stupidest person on earth, which is completely the opposite of the facts. He's brilliant. So what did we do? We read out loud to him as much as possible. We supplement that with audiobooks. I don't know if audiobooks are as popular around the world as they are, but I bought an account where I can download many audiobooks, and he listened to hundreds of audiobooks growing up from 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. He was always listening, and he could be playing with Legos or, building stuff or outside in his tree fort or doing chores. He was always listening, and you know what? He never listened to junk. He only listened to the good and great books. Consequently, his language database became better than most of his sisters who read at an earlier age. And so when he was older and he started to read at 12 and 13, and then he got into competitive speech and debate, his writing was excellent. His writing was more sophisticated than most of his peers. Why? Because he had listened only to the good and the great literature, and he hadn't wasted any time with, Hop on Pop or Max the Cat Sat and drivel like that. And I realized, we think of reading, it's something you have to do with your eyes, but this is not true. Think about blind people who are able to read with their fingers, right? It's still reading, is it not? What about reading with your ears? This is still reading, is it not? And so, kind of defining reading as the taking in of language and comprehending it through the senses shows you the very close connection between listening and reading, and also how that goes to writing. So just to finish up, writing is a very, very complex process. I mentioned this earlier. What's the first thing you have to do? Think of something. Right there, that stops a lot of kids. Have any of you heard kids say, I can't think of anything? Right? And I don't know what to write. I can't think of anything. Well, that right there can be a problem. But once you've thought of something, you get an idea. Now you have to translate that idea into words. Then you have to say those words to yourself. They go from the abstract into the concrete. When you make a sentence, it goes from abstract to concrete. Then you've got something you could actually put into words in a sequence. So you have to say that to yourself. You have to say what you want to write, hear what you said to yourself, and then you have to remember what you said to yourself long enough to use characters to create words, words to create sentences, and record what you heard you say to yourself. When you think about it that way, it's amazingly complex, this whole activity we call writing. And you can imagine how children can kind of get overwhelmed in the process. They may not have an idea. They may not know how to put that idea into words. They may put that idea into words, but have such a short memory they can't remember what they just said to themselves, right? And so they have to develop memory, and then they have to also have the technical skills to spell words, to create sentences, etc., etc. And so how do you learn a complex skill? Well, the most important thing is separate complexity. Think about playing a musical instrument. What if you came in for the first lesson and had to learn everything there is to know all at once? This would be a complete failure, brain overwhelm, unhappy people. So historically, the separation of complexity began with just doing copy work. You don't have to think of what to say, you just copy. Copy words, copy sentences, copy proverbs, copy sayings, copy poems, copy scripture. And if you copy good quality writing, it's going into your brain as well. So that was the first. The second thing that was done almost universally was outlining. This means you're going to figure out what to say before you say it. And so you learn how to make a little outline of ideas. Then when you go to write those ideas into prose, you're already going to be more organized. Most of you would look at that and say, well, that's just common sense. But guess what? Common sense is kind of on the decline in our world today. Also, you've got to have use of grammar, conventions, and then you've either got to have handwriting skill or typing skill. So that's a lot to be having to do. And then on top of that, you've got to have objectivity to be able to read what you wrote, find things that could be improved, polish it up, and rewrite. And that's very difficult. Sadly, though, modern education is failing miserably to teach writing. It is, as I said, so bad that you cannot meet a college professor who does not complain about the bad writing of their university students. Why? Because this is the disastrous approach of the progressive educationists today. Free writing. Just start writing, whatever comes into your brain, whatever you think. Just don't worry about it, just write whatever. That's the attitude of many writing teachers today. Teachers are instructed, only encourage, don't correct. If you correct, if you say, no, it should be this way, that will stifle the creativity of the student. And so you can't teach them the right way to do something because that would interfere with their development. So then consequently, they lack attention to teaching grammar and mechanics since there's no right way, and this whole emphasis on creativity. It's all about self-expression, right? What's the result? Lack of basic skills, lack of basic competence. It is a huge problem, as I said. Right? What's the better way? Well, if you have students grow up with frequent opportunity for narration, you give them copy work so that they practice making the correct characters and words and sentences and punctuation, and they internalize the grammar by imitation. They learn how to outline existing material. It's much easier to retell something than to have to make it up on your own, isn't it? It's easier to retell a story than to have to make up a story. And so historically, that would be the first path, is people would be making up a story, not making up a story, but retelling existing content, summarizing from those notes, and then gradually moving the student toward the original content. And that's kind of what our program is designed to do. The result, competence, confidence, life skill of writing. Just to review, here's the lies of the modern world. One, that parents reading to children inhibits independent reading. That is not true at all. The opposite is true. The more parents read to children, the more children want to read on their own. Two, memorization is at best useless and at worst a burden on children. This was the philosophy of John Dewey back in the 1920s, and it infected and affected modern education. It's simply not true. Children are wired to memorize. If you don't give them good things to memorize, they'll memorize garbage, rap songs, and worse, right? Another lie, writing is about creativity and self-expression. No, writing is not about self-expression. It's about expressing ideas. And if you live long enough and get a little lucky, you might actually have an original idea worth expressing. It's not happened to me yet, but the fact is it's really about expressing ideas, not self. And language skills don't need to be taught. This is the modern lie. We don't have to teach this. It's a natural function of children. Well, it is a natural function, but pretty much everything's a natural function. Music is a natural function, but if you train a singer as opposed to not training a singer, right? If you train a gymnast as to not training, it's common sense. This one particularly irks me. Handwriting is not important in the computer age. I don't have time to go into it, but I could go for a whole hour on how handwriting is very, very important for brain development and all sorts of other reasons, but Eduardo is giving me the time here. So I just want to finish up and leave you with this quote by Confucius. If language is not correct, then what is said is not what is meant, and what ought to be done remains undone. If this remains undone, morals and art will deteriorate. If justice goes astray, the people will stand about in helpless confusion. Hence, there must be no arbitrariness in what is said. This matters above everything. What I find very interesting about this quote is Confucius puts this as an enthymeme, as a syllogism that you complete yourself. Look at that. Morals and art will deteriorate if justice goes astray. Did you notice that? There's a relationship between justice and morals and art. And then, of course, people standing around in helpless confusion, all you have to do is walk into a major American city, and that's what you find. Very confused, helpless-sounding people, and then they go watch presidential debates, and then they see even more helpless confusion. I guess, do we have any time for questions? Okay. And before we do, I just want to let you know that I brought a few gifts for you since you came time. I brought our magazine, which has a few articles and also all of our products. I brought you a DVD, which is an overview of our teaching, writing, instruction style program. And during the conference, I'll have a little table and you can take a look at that. And then a very nice little flash drive with lots of MP3 talks and articles I've written and other sources. So feel free to pick up at the table one of each of those if you like. And you want to facilitate some questions here? Great.
We have time for a few questions, and I have to make 2 announcements. The reason why we need to stick to our time is they're going to collapse the rooms for opening session. So we do have some time for Andrew, and I think you guys are lucky. You know, there's a homeschooling motto that says, if it's for free, it's for me, right? He just gave away some wonderful free stuff. No, but seriously, who would like to ask the first question? Yes.
You talked about your son being dyslexic. What are some signs that a child is dyslexic?
Well, one of the most typical is the reversing of letters. So B's and D's is the most common, or the reversing of the placement of letters. And when they're trying to read, they will confuse these things. And you can, if you're not dyslexic, you cannot understand what's going on. You know, my son, for example, you would show him a word like, you know, bed, B-E-D. Common word, he knows it, but he would look at it and go, Deb, Geb, bag, dag, dad, I don't know. So that was, you know, end of reading lesson for the day. Is overwhelmed because he's moving around things. Now, there are many causes of dyslexia. And I have a little article. If it's not on the flash drive, it's on my website. Thoughts on dyslexia. Because sometimes it's just a lack, in English particularly, of phonics information. Sometimes that prevents. Other times, it's a laterality problem, and you're shifting from right eye dominant to left eye dominant, and it's almost as though your images are constantly shifting on you. That can cause the problem too. Chris, I believe, my son Christopher, is a true dyslexic in that he would actually look at something, and in his brain he would pick it up, turn it around, imagine all the sides of it, and put it back down. So when I see this chair, I just look at this chair. When he sees the chair, he would simultaneously imagine the other side of it. That's why dyslexic people often make great inventors and architects like, well, Einstein, Edison, they're both horrible in school, very dyslexic. Da Vinci, right? Why? Because they see things we don't see, or at least me. There's a good book on this subject called The Gift of Dyslexia, which I would recommend if you believe you have a student, a child who has this going on. But what I've noticed is right around puberty, when kids turn about 13, 14, they get this burst of power, right? Especially the boys. It's just like, boom, male willpower. And they can somehow force their eyes and brain to bring those things together that they couldn't do when they were 8, 9, 10. The other thing with the problem of like my son who moves things all around in his brain and looks at the other side is two-dimensional things. You can't pick them up. There is no other side. So they get very frustrated. That's why one of the things we finally did for him after reading This Gift of Dyslexia was make clay letters. Spend a whole day just making a clay alphabet, because then you can pick the thing up and get it, the whole into your brain rather than being stifled by that two-dimensional. Is that helpful?
Fantastic. Thank you. I think we had, was that one more question? Were you raising your hand, sir? No? Okay. Room for one more. We will have cocktails outside. All right, go ahead.
I've got 2 questions that you can answer, whichever one you prefer. One is audiobooks. Can you give us a recommendation for a site you use for audiobooks? And secondly, you referred to research. Do you have a spot where you can quote the research? I think
Audible.com also is now owned by Amazon, which is a very international company. And so I think you can go to Audible, and I'm guessing most of the books are English, but I have seen titles in Spanish or French, so you might be able to find other languages. And if you have Audible Portugal or whatever, you might be able to find books in Portuguese or Brazil, I don't know. But there's also some free audio book websites. My favorite is LibriVox, Librivox. You know this one? Yeah, .org or .net, one or the other, .org. And it's free. Free, LibriVox, voice, free voice. LibriVox, LibriVox. And there are others as well. In terms of research, are you talking particularly about my comment on handwriting and the brain?
Well, you mentioned those different myths. And if that is not true, it's not true.
Yes. Well, not compiled into one space. I mean, this is decades of my experience in reading and research. The one I could say is if you're interested about handwriting in particular, how handwriting affects the brain differently than typing, how cursive handwriting affects the brain differently than printing handwriting. I do have all that collected in one spot, and you could email to me, andrew@iew.com. I could send you that PowerPoint that has all the primary sources. Yeah, no, I'm not the academic, so I'm not too good at footnoting everything. But I try to be sure everything I say is true to the best of my knowledge. And of course, I am always right.
Okay, on that note, let's give another round of applause. Thank you again, Andrew. All right, so I have two announcements as we wrap up our session here. I do believe that they could approach you afterwards, right, for other questions they might have? Okay. Fantastic, and you get your freebies as well. So two announcements, please. So now that we're done, if we could ask everyone to please go out, because I mentioned they're going to collapse this. I think we can hear that they're wrapping up, but we want to be proactive and be ready, right? So let's vacate. You can talk outside in the foyer. The second, if you purchased meals for this event, like on the back of your ID, there are meals there. You can now get all of the stubs from Brittany. You want to go to the foyer, which is right out here, and look for Brittany between 4 to 6. Okay, so just those two. Please proceed outside if you want to chat and talk. And second, your meal stubs are with Brittany outside. Thank you guys. Have a great rest of the day.